but I think, what do you think? You guys want to get started? Because the first couple of slides is just going to be me babbling anyway, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Nathan.
Yep, that sounds fine.
So, hey, so first of all, thanks to moderator panelists for all of you for coming out and spending your afternoon with us. All the attendees that are here and are on their way, really appreciate it. I know everybody's on the verge of being webinared out, and I can't wait to get back to being live, but here we are. Just if you would go to the next slide. So for today, I actually normally at the tail end of the meeting, normally talk about what's coming up and say a few words in that. Unfortunately, I have to be off by just about 4 o'clock for another meeting. So, but Paul McMillan's going to jump on at the tail end in case I can't close. But there's just a couple of slides up front for those of you that aren't familiar with the WTA. Believe it or not, we've been around since 1973. I won't go into all the detail, but we've been around for a while. We've changed our format. Things have gone very well. You know, and we're trying to do what we can in the virtual world. I will tell you, I'm pretty excited about our board meeting earlier. We're actually talking about potentially, we're going to be virtual in July. We already have a panel and everything set up for July, but in August, we are looking to go live with, given the circumstances, we're going to see how that builds up, and we'll keep everybody abreast of that, because, you know, it may be a model where it's a hybrid and we can only have X amount at the meeting, and then we do, you know, there's many people that have concerns and they'd rather be, you know, remote, but we're absolutely, you know, with WTA, it's really all about networking, not only about the topic, but be able to talk to all of your colleagues face to face. And, you know, it's, you know, again, it's been challenging with the virtual because everybody's doing everything virtual now, but we're absolutely excited about having that conversation. And it was unanimous. All 12 board members were, yeah, we want to do something live in August. So we're very excited about it. But with everything going on in the world, we're going to be responsible and do the right things. And, you know, we'll keep everybody abreast of what's going on there. So a lot of good things that are coming. We are going to be live for our golf outing in September. I guarantee you that. All right. Next slide, Nathan. And we actually have a couple of new sponsors as of this past week. I want to throw a shout out to our net group, who just signed up as a silver, and we actually had Dell Technologies just sign up as a partner in the general group. But these, without these sponsors, we don't move forward. They have a lot of faith in us. It continues to grow, and we're very excited about, you know, of everything we've got going on in the future. We've already got the rest of the year laid out, and I'm already talking to the crew about what it is that I'd like to see for 2021. So WTA is going to be around for a while, as far as I'm concerned. We try to get ourselves involved. Nathan, I'm sure you're familiar with Milwaukee Tech Hub Coalition. I'm hopeful that Kathy is actually going to join us today. She was going to try to jump on and see what we got going on, but I've been talking with her and Lena from Summerfest Tech Days and Mike from, you know, all the different groups. It's we're glad to be part of this community and very proud of all of our sponsors and our involvement. So thanks to all the sponsors. What's the next one? So just a little housekeeping. If anybody out there has a question, please use your Q&A. We'll monitor that throughout. If it's relative to what we're talking about at the time, I'll probably pop on and say, Nathan, we have somebody that I'd like to talk, or that would like this question answered. It's relative. Otherwise, every couple of slides, we have an area where we'll look at the Q&A and we'll ask the panelist, and we'll take it from there. We do have a virtual networking session afterwards. There'll be a link that I believe Chuck will put into the chat at the very tail end, if anybody's interested in the networking afterwards. So I think that was it. Again, I'll be leaving at the end, but Paul McMillan will jump in and do some sort of a closing. He's our sponsorship director. And do we have that poll, Chuck? Can we throw that up for the attendees that we have? All right. So we're interested. We're gonna start using this polling a little bit more, but we'd like to know where everybody is hearing about. How do you find out about the meeting? So we have the website, we have our meetups, we have our LinkedIn, but there's other venues. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a second, and the host and the panelists can't vote, but the rest, please feel free to respond to that, and I'll give you a minute here. We'll give you another 10 seconds. How's it look, Chuck? You getting responses?
Well, we got 2 more to go. Come on, whoever didn't vote, vote.
We want them all. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're good, Chuck. What's it look like?
Oh, you want me to tell?
Yeah, we want you to tell.
The most is email blasts, then LinkedIn, other meetups, and then a friend.
Really? Wow. We got to figure out what's going on. We need to use this website more. All right. Well, we'll get
no one from the website, it says.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, let's take that information. We'll share that with Molly and the rest of the team, and we'll do what we can to maximize getting the word out. So, Nathan, I'm going to throw it over to you, and you can take control. I'll hide in the background, and it's all you, pal.
All right, thank you. All right, so today we're going to talk about build versus buy and have a really interesting conversation about the value and the reason for pursuing each of those. But before we do so, let's introduce the panelists that are here to talk about it. So first and foremost, not foremost, but first, I am Nathan Lesnowski. I am Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I've been in the Milwaukee area in technology consulting and at Concurrency for 19 years. I love the Milwaukee area, love Wisconsin, grew up in Green Bay, and very proud to be from and working and doing really incredible things in tech in Wisconsin and being able to be part of this fantastic community. So very thankful and honored to be here. And now looking forward to introducing our fantastic panelists. Let's start with Chris Williams. Chris is the managing member of Element 79 Law and director of compliance with Think Markets. So Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Excuse me. So I started out with as a regulator for securities and moved that over to the private practice to help with broker-dealers, and that's where the Think Markets comes in. They are a broker-dealer coming into the U.S., along with working with startups and their capital raises, typically on the fintech side.
Awesome. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
And our next panelist is Tom Bozer. He is a software engineer with Le Mans Tech. Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. I started my first business up in 2002 called Olam LLC, and kind of fits right in with this topic, build versus buy. We did a lot of consulting work and built my own product line, and that product ended up partnering with one of my clients, and as a result of that product, they grew and landed some big contracts and were purchased by private equity. Long story short, started up my second business with some of my past partners at Olam, and we call that Le Mans Tech. Le Mans, 24 hours of racing, so we figured 24 hours of IT, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of the same type of thing. Consulting and also product development.
Awesome. Super interested in your opinions today. So thank you for joining us, Tom.
Thanks.
All right. And now next we have Chris Weisopel. Chris is the CTO for Veracode. Welcome, Chris. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Sure. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Veracode. Started the company 14 years ago. We are about 700 people, and our focus is application security testing. So we build a SaaS application. So, obviously we're a SaaS company, we're building software, but we build software, then we work with other companies so that they can test their software. Before that, I was a developer. I worked for a commercial software company. After that, I went into consulting and did some custom software. So I feel like I've done all the different modes you could be in around software. So happy to be here to talk about that and talk about, you know, the security aspects of buy versus build too.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And then finally, we have Michael Kristonoff, who is a serial entrepreneur, has the best beard of the panelists on the call, and has also been on some other presentations this week. So welcome, Michael. You want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Of course, and a pleasure to be here. As mentioned, serial entrepreneur. I graduate student, so I have a very strong connection to both private sector, but also public sector research as well. I was a researcher in UWM's Disruptive Technology Lab in their School of Information Studies, where I architected the framework of an autonomous decentralized asset marketplace, which for me, I wanted to kind of pitch it as kind of like a startup. So I was thinking to myself, like, what does the build kind of aspect of that look like? I'm also in their immersive media lab as well, focusing on aspects of augmented reality and virtual reality. As for I take on a bunch of different projects, whether it's in physical product, digital, ed tech, fintech, or as mentioned, the autonomous marketplace with blockchain.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm sure you're going to provide a lot of interesting insights. All right, so let's go forward for the first question. And this is for all of our panelists. I'd love to hear each of your perspective on this question. What are some of the common reasons to pick build versus buy, and vice versa? You know, what would be the reasons why someone would buy an off-the-shelf piece of software and choose to implement that, or choose to construct and build their own from scratch piece of software? And give me a little bit of understanding of the tension that might exist between those two answers to this.
Well, I guess I can start. I know when we think about this at Veracode, a lot of it is like there's a huge value to having it now, right? Whether it's something that's complementing our offering, or it's a new marketing tool, or it's something that's going to automate our process on the back end. There's a whole range of reasons that, you know, having it sooner rather than later is good. It's good for your business, especially if you're like in a growth business where you can take advantage of you know, maybe it'll help you to grow faster, right? Maybe your constraint is you're not able to hire employees to do something, so it can help you grow faster. So the time to value of buying can be high, but of course you're going to be potentially paying for that in different ways. But I mean, we're going to talk about sort of the downside. But I think for me, part of the big upside is I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait for something, and there's so many options now for purchasing software or having it custom developed for you, that you can really make that, you know, do I want to wait for this or do I need it now?
I can also jump on that question. So generally, if you are then you have to manage a lot of moving pieces, a lot of micros, each of which have their own maintenance cost internally from a development standpoint. When you go with an outside vendor, or you go with someone that provides a pre-built solution that can solve a problem just good enough for your business solution, you don't necessarily have to worry about as many moving pieces. And if you're trying to be a lean startup or a very lean enterprise, it really is a matter of what is the core component of your business that creates value, and is that something that is rare, unique, and is it something that you have to build internally yourself, or just can it be a configuration of something that's already on the market?
One build on question, I'm kind of curious for both of you on that. What's your perception of what build really means, versus what buy really means? And I think we have this perception that when we buy something, it's a packaged product and it's ready to go. Or if we build something, it's going to be years and years of work to be able to get something off the shelf and do it, whereas there might be different definitions of what that really means. So like, what's your perception when you say that word build or say the word buy?
Yeah, it's really it used to be black and white, but it's really moved to a gray area now, because people want to build something fast. So when they build it, they're leveraging APIs that someone else is providing. You're leveraging open source. So you're taking on sort of some of the risk there, and you don't have as much control necessarily of it as a pure build. So in the build world, you're really not 100% building anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we have to decide, are we 50% building, right? And then on the buy world, a lot of the value comes from things that are extensible and customizable. And most enterprise software needs some customization, right? So to some degree, you're building, and you have to have people that are capable of doing that extensibility and customization, or you have to buy that and hire consultants to do it. So it isn't black or white anymore. It's more like you have to decide how much you're buying or how much you're building. I think is now the way you have to sort of think about it.
Absolutely. And to second that point, in philosophy, there's actually a paradox. It's called Socrates' paradox. At what point, if you have a heap of sand, at what point do you keep taking weight, and at what point is it still called a heap? You have a build solution, but at what point do you add customizations to a point where you just you have a buy solution, but at what point does it become a build solution? I think one of the differentiations for software is at what point does it become managed by an internal team? That's kind of where I'm thinking of it. Is if you have a dedicated number of people or personnel working on a software suite solely to try to work with its customizations, its moving pieces, that has turned a buy into a build.
Yeah, I think the reality is, someone's building it. It's just, do you want it in-house, or are you going to outsource it, or has it already been built, right? So economies of scale. If something's built and used at multiple places, it tends to get tested better because you've got more users using it, and the more reliable it becomes, and you've got more people testing it. And that's probably one of the bigger risks of the more code that you develop in-house, the less testing that actually ends up being done. And so with that problem, you tend to have those risks of bugs and people being down. So, you have to always factor in the testing process, which everyone seems to lack wanting to do that. Developers want to just start building code and start getting it out there, and without a good test process in place, which adds a lot more to the cost and again slows your delivery down potentially. But reliability is really, and you were talking, Christian, earlier about security. That's another component to that build process. How often do we think about security when we're building something? It's very easy to just look at a set of requirements and then try to solve those requirements and not think about the bigger picture and reliability and security and scalability.
Right, like, for example, security, if I'm buying it, I can take care of that as a contractual obligation, right? I can say, show me your process. Is this something which is certified by a SOC 2 or something like that? And I can do it with one person over a few days. Whereas if I'm building, the security has to be done by you, right? So now you need to buy tools. You need to have developers or a security team that's educated, and that can be that can be much more cumbersome than relying on the supplier to do it and just checking that they did it correctly.
Absolutely. And I know, speaking from a startup perspective, it is so incredibly sexy to try to build your own microservices, or try to build your own security, or try to build your own holistic product that captures everything. And from a business standpoint, it's not always the smartest thing to do, because if, let's say, a startup is trying to get venture capital, or they're trying to just improve activity within their team. Let's develop this service, even though it cannot be directly traced to kind of like the bottom line of what we're providing. I think the optics of building something sometimes supersede the value proposition that is actually being from a startup standpoint, because people want to look active. They want to look like they're good teams, like they're able to raise money for venture capital, and that it can create a lot more issues in the long run, versus just like swallowing one's pride and saying, okay, maybe we don't have our own content management service, or we don't have to reinvent the wheel, basically.
Yeah. So just to follow on that, because there is certainly, I think the flip side is the competitive advantage that a lot of organizations are looking for if they can differentiate with their software, right? So software, if you think about enterprise software, it used to be, automating labor, right? It used to be all back-end process, right? Expense reports and marketing programs and all things that a customer doesn't touch. It's really just becoming more efficient and better at your back-end processes. But really, in the last 10 years, we've seen people competing with their front end, how they interact with customers. And so that if you're competing with a software interface that interacts with their customers, now it takes on a different importance to the business to be a little bit better and not mediocre, right? This is why, like, every national bank builds their own online banking platform, right? They all have their own, but a mid-sized bank can't afford to do that. And if you look at a mid-sized bank, they're just customizing, they're skinning some generic online banking, and it's pretty mediocre. And then you can't add a new feature, right? Like, I remember when Chase came out with to take a picture of your check to deposit a check. They were actually the first ones that came out with it. Other people followed on, but because they had that, they had something to talk about. Like, our online banking is actually better. So when you build your own, you can try to differentiate from your competition, not with just cost savings, but actually trying to get customers and sell more to customers. So that's one of those trade-offs you have to think about.
That's a really interesting point that you brought up, and maybe to expand on that for the panelists, what is your take on competitive differentiation and its relationship to build versus buy? Does competitive differentiation always mean build, or can it mean buy, or is it somewhere in between? Kind of break that down a little bit.
Well, if it's going to be hard for you to build, like you don't have a development team, or you just don't have the capabilities, you might want to buy and then start to figure out how to build. But I think you have to figure out, is software a competitive differentiator for your company? Because if it is, that you're going to lean more towards the builds, because you're going to want to have something that differentiates you from your competition. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, like, not every corporate website is just a WordPress website, because there's only so much you can do. Sometimes you need more interactivity and more customization of that, and then you have to start to build things as opposed to just sort of be customizing an off-the-shelf package.
Yeah, the challenge, I mean, you do have that competitive edge, but one of the challenges in building softwares that those of us who've been around long enough remember the days of C and C++ being the primary languages of doing your development. And then over the years, Java's come, it's kind of already peaked. .NET's kind of come, these are kind of like now they're old news. There's more languages, and so young developers coming out of school don't want to use these old tools. Those who remember COBOL, now the COBOL developers are making probably more than all the other developers are making because you can't find them and nobody wants to learn the language anymore because it's considered obsolete. Although there's still a lot of software out there, especially in the mainframe world and banking world that relies on this software, and someone's got to support it. And so it's that support life cycle. If the solution, if you're not really a software development company, but you want to build something and you're not looking to sell it to other people and you want it competitively in-house, you've got to think about what's the life cycle of that software really going to be, because at some point everyone will catch up anyways. And I mean, even let's look at Microsoft. How many times now they have Microsoft Teams? Before it was Skype for Business. Before that it was Office communication. I mean, they just keep some of it. I don't know if it's even maybe an all completely new product now with Teams, but they just keep rebranding or reflavoring or redeveloping this thing. And when do you throw the code away and start over again? And one of the challenges with build is also, some developers are lifers, but some of them are not. They live for being on something new and cutting edge, and as soon as it's no longer like that anymore, they kind of get tired of it and they move on, and you lose all that expertise. So now you've got to hire some more people and bring them in, teach them, get them supported. Kind of holds you back. So depending on the complexity of it and what your business really is doing, it may be far better off to either contract it, or if you need it really custom, or to hire a firm that buy a product that can be customized, like we were talking about, whereas you're scripting it versus a complete build. But it is really tough. You made some really good points. If you want to get something, be the first to market. I worked with a local bank, and we produced a solution so that they could make debit cards at their branches, and they were doing this over 10 years ago, and community bank, so they wanted to be on the front edge of that, and there was really no solution that worked with the Fiservs of the world, and Fiserv didn't offer anything like that at the time. So being able to have that competitive edge, because they want to be able to have a new customer come into their branch and be able to issue them a card right there. So we built that, and having the requirements and understanding it, the complexity of it, that's the build versus buy. It's like once it's kind of out there, and it's tough to say you would want to build it. But it was a good point that if you want to be on the leading edge of something, you may have to build it to be able to offer to your customers.
Want to ask Chris Williams, kind of pop you into this conversation a little bit. What's your perspective on the reasons why you might go from a build to a buy and vice versa? Sort of the maybe the angle that you're seeing on this picture, maybe not necessarily a technical angle, maybe more of a business angle, or something else from your perspective.
I'm not sure if Chris is there. I don't see him sitting at his desk.
Aha. Okay. Well, we will shift on from Chris then. Super. All right. So maybe shifting into the next part of this conversation, which are there specific software solutions that are better off as custom versus buying? So are there ones where, and you brought this up a little bit, when you talked about differentiation, when you talked about security ownership, and you talked about bringing something unique to the market, but maybe bringing this to kind of double clicking on this to a level of, here's a scenario that I think has really worked well in the build scenario. Here's a scenario that doesn't work real well in the build scenario, and I really would suggest people go toward a buy situation. Can you kind of start to break that down for us?
Well, I think I'm going to start with something which is, again, like it's a blurred line of of how much you're actually building. Like say your company wants to have a mobile app, right? I would say, don't do, unless you're, a software development shop, use a sort of a low code environment to build your mobile app, where you're not writing, Swift on iOS or Java on Android. That you're using a no code / low code environment where you can describe what your mobile app does. And I think this is one of those places where it's kind of blurred, where you don't want to write a native code in a lot of places. And to some degree, if you use the right frameworks, you're just basically customizing that framework to build a mobile app, which might just be essentially a data entry app, but you needed something more than a mobile friendly website. And I think that, that might be a good reason to build your own application. And then if you don't need very sophisticated things on the back end, use a back end as a service. So I think I'm answering in a place where you're just building as little of the app as possible, even when you do want to have something customized. I think a mobile app might be a good reason to do that.
What about the buy side? Where is that a great, understanding that it's somewhere in a continuum, not so much in a like either or, but like, where are scenarios where you've seen that work particularly well?
I guess I could start. I think it's when it's a back office kind of solution, where it's sort of like a lot of enterprises need this kind of technology. So there is pretty standardized solutions for doing it. Like, obviously things like, expense reporting or something like that is pretty standardized. You're just going to buy a solution that you can then, customize. But I think that, there's a continuum there.
You don't see Chris, so you're talking like an accounting system. I mean, you just don't see people developing those anymore.
That would be crazy.
There's so many good ones out there.
Exactly.
Right.
Or situations that are very much commodity, right? Like, we're not building new operating systems, right? We've got a lot of those on the market. There's some established vendors. I'm not building a new mobile phone operating system. I'm getting that from my established vendor. There's certain things like that where I'm taking advantage of what's in the market. It's not my competitive advantage. It's sort of the landing zone for all productivity and work. Any other examples from your mind that really fit into that sector?
I think part of it is solved by, can I customize it to do what I want it to do?
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be some work there, because you're going to have to evaluate it. You're going to have to, figure out if you can customize a purchase solution to meet your needs. So, you're going to just have to have a proof of concept period where you can kind of get an understanding, working with the vendor, if it can be customized to meet your needs. Because that's typically, you're going to want to buy if you can do something like that, because, like Tom was saying, like, you don't have to manage the life cycle. You have to hope that the vendor supports your customizations going into the future. But I think that's that just requires a good evaluation period, and that's always going to be cheaper than building it yourself if you can meet the needs there.
Is the new buy essentially not so much just the thinking about in the sense of commodity tech, but also thinking about it, like you mentioned this, Chris, like the scenario where you're constructing an application, but a lot of it are pre-made parts. Like I'm doing a bot, but I'm using bot framework. I'm using cognitive services. I'm using a pre-built interaction engine that leverages natural language. And I'm kind of combining these pieces together, but I'm not necessarily creating something entirely from scratch. Is that kind of the new buy, versus build?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Tom was alluding to that with like people aren't writing in C++ and Java and .NET anymore. They're using these languages like Node.js, which have huge frameworks and huge components that can do pretty much anything. So you're writing just your business logic, which is kind of like just doing that customization phase of a packaged product. But also you can leverage, like you mentioned, natural language processing. If you're building in the cloud, Microsoft has an API for that, right? AWS has an API for that. So yeah, maybe the new customization of packaged software is just building on the components that are out there in open source and from commercial cloud providers. The challenge there is you're responsible for security, you're responsible for maintenance, whereas if you're customizing, another system, that's probably less likely. So it's a little bit more build, but it is kind of the new buy. I think we can start to think of it that way.
Sort of like, for example, people aren't necessarily building their own identity platform as often as they used to be. They're using, say, Azure AD B2C.
For that.
Right, there's off-the-shelf stuff, but you're still building it in a sense. You're still responsible for security because you're bringing it all together and delivering it to your customers. So the bar's a little higher than what it might have been before.
Right, like for example, it's easy to do username and password, but if your requirement is multi-factor, hooking up an Okta or something like that is you're just configuring it to work with your software.
So much of it breaks down to a total cost of ownership equation of what can be refactored, what can be reused, and just in general, it's like as an example, when I was architecting this digital distribution platform that effectively used P2P to facilitate transfer of content quicker, using fragmented files and everything. I wouldn't necessarily have to go into a P2P. I wouldn't necessarily have to rebuild a P2P client from scratch. I would have to. I could just look at what exists out there already. But if I wanted to have absolute knowledge of how that information is fragmented, stored, and shared between users, then I wouldn't necessarily be able to have that control. That's from my perspective.
Got it. Now, when you think about this in the context of low code, no code sort of scenarios, things where it's not necessarily a true developer, it's sort of a configurator, right? It's a Power Apps kind of scenario or an RPA sort of scenario where it's a business user building the application that may not necessarily be a developer. It's sort of one click below a developer in terms of their skill level. How does that fit into this question? And what's the responsibilities that might be tied to that? In the sense that that's both custom software but also off the shelf.
That strikes very, very familiar. I used to do SharePoint customizations to a degree for a project management office on campus, and a lot of it was it was getting very close to kind of to that build customization of it. I think if there's custom logic being implemented, whether it's being coded in with high complexity, high fidelity, in its own language, or it's being customized using, say, for example, SharePoint Designer, and it's just automating certain business flows. These are different levels of build, but build nonetheless. Kind of in my mind's eye, it would be a matter of what is the cost of maintenance for this? Because for a SharePoint customizer, the cost of maintenance is not so much so as, say, trying to maintain 10,000 lines of code.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the low code, no code works well when it's more of that enterprise back end kind of application where you just have a process that you need employees to do, or maybe a partner to do. I think they get challenging when it sort of has to be customer facing and scale large and maybe integrate in with other things. So for certain use cases, I think it's going to be much lower cost of ownership and quicker time to market. But it's just not going to work for all use cases.
Awesome. All right, well, let's go to kind of a related question, which is the control that the control that the organization has, or maybe even customers have in either scenario. You know, if you think about from the raw ground up application development with very little off the shelf, pulling to, the far right side of, a package that like a Salesforce.com that maybe is configured a little bit, or you have a low code scenario. What's the context of organizational control or customer control in these scenarios that you think is important?
One of the first things that actually jumped to mind was the legal aspect of things. Because if with increased control, with increased kind of like ownership over what's being done, also comes increased responsibility as well. And if suddenly there's a piece of software that, say, for example, is operating in Europe but is not compliant with GDPR, that's an issue. If suddenly there's user information that's leaked, it comes back to the owner of that software. But with buying, liability then begins to fall on, begins to be distributed between different vendors. If you are providing a certain service, but suddenly your web host or suddenly or hosting your data or service suddenly gets breached, the liability then falls on them, with you being kind of like party to that. I'm not a lawyer, but that's kind of how I see it in one instance.
I have to be the doom and gloom. Sorry to jump in and be late on this one, you guys. A lot of contracts limit liability, so just make sure that you kind of pay attention to what you're signing or clicking yes to.
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, you have far more control. Depending on how much is being built, and the more it's being built, the more control you're going to have. And that gets back to earlier, we were talking about the timelines. But it's not like, there's some pretty big companies in the state of Wisconsin. They're still not going to, no matter how big they are, very few are going to tell Microsoft how to build something, depending on what it is. You're not going to change Microsoft Office because you don't like the color if they didn't allow you to configure the color. If it was like, you're just, whereas a smaller company, usually bigger companies, if you want more control, you find someone smaller than you that has the capability of doing it, and they're going to answer to it because, they don't want to lose, either the employees don't want to, it's a job for them, right? Or if it's a consulting company and you have a combination of them that are building it, you're their most important vendor, so to speak. Whereas, when you're going up the other side of things, the Salesforces, the Oracles, the Microsofts, Googles, they're not going to do a lot of changes for most companies. I'm sure there's a few out there, but the vast majority of us are not in that space. So if the tool itself can't be customized by the way they developed it, it's not too likely that you're going to get a contract with them. Oh, Microsoft, I want you to keep Windows 7 an extra 5 years for me because I have it deployed all over. I don't think most businesses can afford to pay Microsoft to keep that going. So even though that's Microsoft's custom build, right? So when it comes to control, if you have the source, the more source you have, you really have more control over it. But that mean you have the control. But on the flip side, if you're a decision maker and you don't really understand the code, how much control do you really have either? Because now you're kind of at the mercy of those who are doing the development. So you kind of want the person who has some ownership of the code to have at least some knowledge of coding, not necessarily if they have to write the code for it, but be able to at least know if they're getting taken advantage of by either the development staff or the consulting company, because it's quite often where, how do you know when they say, oh, it's going to take me 5 hours, how do you know it's really taking them 5 minutes versus 5 hours? And so that's like the negative side of having that control. It may not really buy you much. There's so many pros and cons to these scenarios that, having some level of in-house expertise, even on the minimal skinning or the minimal coding, still knowing that your team is either capable of it or your consulting team is capable of doing it, not taking advantage of it, and you end up with something that, because it's classic. I always hear this where the next guy who comes in says, "Oh, that guy did everything wrong. We got to start over," and it's because they didn't understand it, or they don't know the history of it, or they don't know all the things that happened along the way, that maybe that code made sense when it was first developed, but now some new requirements came along the way. And it's kind of like when you're building a house, if the basement was built a certain way and all of a sudden you wanted to add on and you had to shoot the house out, you got to also go all the way down to the basement and make it bigger. Same thing happens in software, where you only know what you know at the time that it's developed. So if the requirements change, sometimes that requires going all the way to that lower level. And how does it fit in so it's smooth, built without a lot of glitches to it? So, and then sometimes say, oh, it does make sense to start over. I kind of been through all those scenarios. So the number one reason you end up starting over is just because something becomes obsolete. An operating system, at one time everything was developed on DOS, and then Windows 3.1, then Windows NT, and NT's kind of grown all the way to what we have now with Windows 10. You've got Linux. Now you're talking about cross-platform development, so that you're safe from what operating system is being used. But sometimes that cross-development platform becomes bloated and slow versus when we were talking about developing more native, you get that performance, right? So, I developed an app years ago, my first mobile app, those who remember Nextel, these Nextel little Motorola phones, the walkie-talkie ones, they were GPS programmable, and we were writing GPS programmable code native on those phones, because back then your data plans were quite expensive. It was like $10 a month for 1 megabyte. So we were capturing GPS coordinates and pumping these things up. We had to try to keep it so that the costs weren't ridiculous. Well, rather than, doing XML or even JSON, we were running pure TCP sockets and packing our code so that these packets were small and efficient, so that we weren't bloating the data plan. So, an off-the-shelf component isn't going to necessarily give you that capability if you have those, depending on what the requirements are and the concerns are. So you have to, a lot of it just comes down to ultimately what are the requirements, what are you trying to solve, and then, do cost-benefit analysis and try to figure out what, and research buy versus build, versus outsource versus in-source. It can be very complicated though, depending on what it is.
Yeah, I think an interesting way to look at who's in control is also like who's responsible for securing it. And like if you're in control, you're responsible for securing it. And when we start to go to the cloud model, you start to see these separation of duties between what, say, the cloud provider says they're securing, which is what they control, and like what you're securing, what you control. So, in the cloud, when you're building an application, you can be building on top of these services like S3 for file storage or Aurora for database, and these different services that then, you don't have to secure, you don't have to maintain, you don't have to keep up to date. So again, this is like where we're getting, it's a blurred world, especially with cloud native development, where you can build something, but leverage, 90% of your app, you can have the cloud provider worrying about maintaining it, keeping it up to date. If something becomes obsolete, they still have to, whatever their end of life scenario for different services. And by letting them have control of that stuff, it's less work for you. So I would say even if you have all the reasons to build today, it's something where it's a competitive differentiator for you. You need something unique. You do have some staff. Try to build as little as possible because that's what things like cloud allow you to do today. So even if you're building, it may behoove you to just be building that business logic, right? And trying to leverage as much of what a cloud provider can give you.
I was thinking that, in the context of control, that for the developer, certainly building your own software gives you more control. But sometimes from a feature standpoint, surrounding the control that you provide back through to the business, the product owner, or the application customer, sometimes you're harnessing the power of the work being done by another company that facilitates features that provide control. Example being like, if I'm leveraging an off-the-shelf cloud-based identity platform, I'm getting multi-factor auth and risk understanding and potentially device health integrated into my application, providing control back to my customer, or governance that might be provided to them via a bot platform that I wouldn't have had the funds to build myself. So it seems that it kind of means control for whom sometimes, versus just maybe binary on I have more features, I have more control over my software itself, but I may not be actually serving my customer with more control in some cases. Any other thoughts on that angle? All right. Cool. All right. Well, here, let's go to our next section, which is on audience questions. So I know I think we probably have some. So let's check out our group here.
There's nothing there, Nathan.
Nothing in there yet, huh?
Nope.
All right. Well, if you have a question, let's get our audience answering them. And we can always come back to it. Cool.
There was one. Oh, okay. The panelists can all see it, but it's just a hello from one of the people that had to leave.
No worries. No worries.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's go into this next area about cost. So, we've been talking about the relationship between ground up application development, low code, no code, customization, a Salesforce versus a Dynamics versus a building my own CRM system. Michael, you've had some really interesting comments regarding cost of maintenance, cost of maintaining code versus cost of maintaining a platform. When you guys think about this idea of cost, what are you considering here? What are in what scenario are you considering what?
Yeah, so in looking at, I always look at it as a function of managing complexity. The more complex a solution becomes, the more costly it becomes to manage it. And thus, if you're looking at it from a talent perspective, the more expensive talent will have to be in order to help manage it. it goes back to, say, the example of SharePoint customization using very low amounts of coding versus someone that has to manage massive libraries every day. So ultimately, the less complex something becomes, if you're considering reducing your complexity, you'll likely have a reduction in cost as well. But but it has to be kind of a question of, is what you're doing contributing to you being just a contender or someone that can actually compete in the market that you're trying to be in? And if just buying something doesn't shift you away from that, all for it.
Awesome. Any other thoughts?
Well, I think total cost of ownership was mentioned. I think that's something that you have to try to figure out, like what's the lifetime of this, which might be a challenge. Is this something that in 2 or 3 years is going to be obsolete? We're not going to be using anymore, or is this something very fundamental that we could see using for 20 years? I can tell you one thing, that software hangs around a lot longer than you think it will.
Very true.
So it never seems to die. You have to keep maintaining it into the future. So definitely overestimate on how long people are going to want to be using it in the organization. But yeah, that total cost of ownership goes into it. It might actually be less expensive to, if the system's going to be around for a long time, to build it versus being paying maintenance for 20 years. So I think that's the lens that you kind of have to look through. And part of it is the hardware and the network and the infrastructure, if it's on premise or if it's in the cloud. Are you paying monthly fees for VMs and storage and things like that, versus buying, which might be like a SaaS application? So you're leveraging the economies of scale of the SaaS provider, and it could be less expensive there. And then we talked, like, it's hard to be black or white today, right? You're probably going to do some customization of something which is a buy. Or when you're building, you're going to leverage a lot of APIs and components and things like that. So that all has to go into that TCO calculation.
That makes sense. Let's double click into this cost conversation, into considerations of how to make best use of that cost. If let's say we're building a piece of software, we're building a software product, and we want to apply our investment. What have you seen work there? Is 4-week sprint, is 2-week, 4-week sprints, is a certain amount of upfront planning working best before you get to that? Is a consideration toward pulling things off the shelf as much as possible to avoid, to enable rapid development and to best apply these costs? Tell me a little bit about your perspective on, like, how, if I had money to spend, how I best spend that money.
One of the first things that came to mind was, if I had $5,000 just as a very, very lean budget, and I wanted to make the first iteration towards, if I wanted to test a business hypothesis or try to understand where does most of my value as a business come from in today's day and time, where can I get the most amount of user testing quickly? It's probably, my mind jumps to, it's probably better to buy at very low iterations, where you have to test hypotheses, you have to understand value propositions and see, like, what really has to change. And this is from a startup perspective. But at a higher at a higher end, you can, if you're buying something, you can leverage those economies of scale, as I mentioned, that you don't have to build yourself. So buying kind of helps calibrate almost, and building helps you almost go deeper into what you're doing, if that makes sense from that perspective.
I think one of the big factors, whether you're whether you're building or buying, because like we mentioned earlier, even when you're building, you tend to end up purchasing third-party controls, and it comes down to like royalties also. So if I'm building something or I want to deploy something to many, many people, regardless of scalability, if every user like you were talking about SharePoint, if every user I had to pay a $30 cal, at what point is it where I'm going to say, well, the SharePoint is just not a good investment, no matter how much of a head start it gives me, because I'm going to get just killed on buying all these CALs. So, it may be another tool that may be not quite as good as SharePoint, but it's going to allow me to scale it and not kill me to, spend all this money on CALs and maintenance to Microsoft in that scenario. But, or I maybe have to just build it all from scratch. So that cost factor, royalties is a big cost factor that goes into it. I usually look for a lot of development that I do, and I do need third party, is royalty-free distribution, so that I have to pay for their software development kit, and it may not be an inexpensive software development kit, but I can deploy this to thousands of users, and I don't have to pay for every one of those users. And that even becomes just a licensing hassle when you deal with that. Every time, I've got to account for that. Oh, I need 20 more seats. Now I got to buy 20 more seats from my vendor as well. And so it's a challenge. So anytime, some things are just unavoidable, but if you can avoid those in a scenario where you might, oftentimes when you build, if you're end up building a product that's good enough, you might want to sell it even to your competitors. My first job, I worked for a division of Quad Graphics, was Quad Tech, and we would build, I worked on the inkjet controllers, and after we developed it for Quad's requirements, we were selling the same controllers to their competitors, and it was, worldwide. And it's amazing how then you start developing to their competitors, you learn more new things that actually improve the parent company. So, you never know really when you build something. If you come up with a new idea, even though it might be a business advantage for your own business, it still may be even a good idea. It could be an idea that's good enough to go and sell to others. So knowing what those royalties are of your idea can really impact, another cost that you need to consider along the way.
And if I can jump in, sorry. Sorry for stepping away before and then having to come back. So I apologize for that. And so I'm guessing you guys already covered this, but just one thing that tends to pop up every once in a while with the startups I've dealt with on the tech side, the fintech side, looking at measuring cost again, it's not as obviously you get what you pay for a lot of times. We've had some startups come through that have found awesome monthly deals on SaaS models from no-name companies, and then all of a sudden those companies disappear and they're scrambling to replace that service. So reputation, or knowing how long the company most likely will survive, is a good factor for the buy side.
Huge point. What have you seen worked well in the ROI model space? As you're applying an investment, that investment could be small or large, but at the end of the day, it needs to pay off. What have you seen work well in the ROI model, and what hasn't worked well?
I think when you're doing a cost savings, it's a lot easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're automating something, you're eliminating labor, or you're just saving time. So I think those it's easier to do an ROI there. I think when it's something that is trying to grow the top line, where you're trying to reach new markets or just grab new customers or accelerate sales, those are harder to figure out the ROI than which is sort of the newer way of using that businesses use software versus the older way, which is, hey, let's get cost out, right? Let's get cost out. Let's automate this. Let's buy a better software solution than we have to save on labor costs, for instance, or to save some fees that we have to pay. So cost savings, I think ROI works really well. It's harder when you're using software to grow your top line.
So how have companies successfully estimated the top line benefit they would get by applying, say, several $1 million to a development effort? I mean, someone's got to write that check, and there's got to be some kind of position as to that it's going to provide new revenue to the business. How are you seeing putting together those kinds of models, and where they've been successful, where haven't they?
Well, you got to know you got to have a good market research team, right? Because if you're going to do a product that you're selling to others, you've got to know how many can you sell. If you have an audience, it's only 1,000 of them, and 500 of them are not going to buy from you, no matter what you do and how great your product is. You only have half the market opportunity. And then if you're, what are they willing to spend on it? You could end up, no matter if you have 50% of the market, but the amount of money you're going to make on the product, because they don't have their funds are the product you're going to build has got limited potential revenue from it. You've got to know what that scope is, what they can afford, so that you can price it. And then once you come up with those approximates, you know what your budget revenue could be. But I think earlier you mentioned that, Chris or one of you guys mentioned that software ends up being around a lot longer than you thought it would be. And that's really true. Gosh, I can't tell you how many times I've run into scenarios where you're integrating to something and you're like, I can't believe someone's still using this thing, and those things will last another 5-10 years after that. So, if people tend to not want to change if something's working. So that one positive of that investment, if you're building something that you're selling to others, is that, again, depending on your revenue model, but most people today are doing some kind of at least software maintenance or software as a service. You've got a recurring revenue model coming in. You got to look at how many years, if you could get that, whatever that percentage of the market would be, and that dollar amount is, there's your ROI, right? So if it costs you X amount of dollars, it tends to end up being a lot more on a startup side that does it, and it's a lot of just pure sweat equity. You end up you really can't, it's just hours, right? And you got to look at opportunity costs. Was it smart to spend your time on that, sweat equity on that versus something else? But businesses that are trying to do some of the other custom builds we were talking about where it's thinner, and I've seen a lot of applications that are written on top of Microsoft Access, and those do not scale well. But so many developed it that way originally, and now somebody starts selling it to other people, and now you have this Access application that's all over the place, and it's sort of a disaster to maintain, upgrade, whatever. And I've done a couple of those where I've redeveloped them. Microsoft, use SQL in the back end, either a client server front end or a web app front end to it, and migration. You'd be surprised how much custom code there is just in migrating from one database format to another database format. There is, so custom code the building can be all over the place, and that's a one-time use just in a migration routine. I guess I'm sort of spinning around on this one too a little bit, but there's a lot of costs that aren't really taken into account, just like a migration alone, that a lot of people don't realize. You talking about CRM, like who would really develop a CRM today? But boy, if you want to switch from one of these CRM platforms to another one, that is not an inexpensive endeavor. These major ones are so different and then to customize them is so different. that if you want a feature in one, now you want to switch to another one, it's actually quite expensive to do. So it's, even though the code is thin.
Mm-hmm.
But I think someone mentioned too earlier, Chris, the other Chris, you mentioned about, how long is the vendor going to be around? If it's a small vendor, it might make a lot of sense that if you want to go with them, make sure in your contract that you have it, that you have some kind of code repository, that if something happens to them, you have access to the source code. And it might be some inconvenience to have to take that thing over, and you may have to hire somebody, but at least if you can at least have access to the source code, you'll understand that data set that's behind it, and you can at least get your data out of it if you have to move to something else. The worst thing is when your data is like trapped and you can't get it out of it, and you can't move it to something else, and you're really stuck then. Because if you have 5-10 years of your business information tied into a system that's no longer around, how do you get it out of there? That could be a real nightmare. So, it's another thing to consider.
Well, yeah, we have, there are always questions about exporting data, and then also regionally, physically, where it's being stored is another big topic for a lot of our clients.
Yeah, there's a lot of compromises going on. I think there was just another big one with the government with their software that they developed to go and intrude on other people was hacked and it was all stolen. So it's like, if it is not secured and locked down really, really well, so, there's going to be someone out there that's going to look for it. And, disaster recovery plans, yeah, I mean, depending on who's hosting it, what good of a job are they doing to make sure that something is compromised? Can you get a backup that's within a certain time frame so that you're not re-entering data from a month ago? It's critical too.
Also, that's that.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, I just remember hearing from developer friends abroad that would essentially speak horror stories of production databases and production servers getting nuked, or suddenly, something gets deleted or overwritten where it shouldn't have been, and now customer information's gone and they didn't have a backup for it, or maybe they did, but it's inaccessible for a week. And how long is it, to access that? So stuff like that.
So kind of building on this cost conversation, we touched a little bit about ROI that ultimately maps the time to value. I'll give you an example on this question. Like, we have a customer that does a payoff period for any one of the software investments they're doing, especially disruptive ones where they're trying to change their market. And they do a evaluation of what they think it's going to look like. They do a monetization strategy, and then they say, well, we're going to invest X number of millions of dollars in this, and here's where we expect to see a payoff. What have you seen work in maximizing time to value, and what are the considerations between build versus buy, or in a particular scenario on achieving a better time to value ratio?
I have sorry, my example is going to be a lot more niche down because we're talking about the finance sector, so it's highly regulated. These people being people I've worked with, that buying something that's already been pre-approved helps really accelerate that time value, and then whatever value they're adding, that's the part they're focusing on building out. Once that's done, they can look at the bandwidth of their development team, along with basically they measure it the revenue generated per employee, and kind of figure that cost out, and that's how they decide whether to remove the buy side and move and develop out. So they're really conscious about getting revenue positive and getting approvals as quickly as possible, so they can get to not a false finish line, an actual usable finish line, but then to reduce their overhead after that fact.
From a startup standpoint, time to value, it's so important to jump in with to basically stake your claim with whatever hypotheses you have. If you have a list of 10 features you think users will like, it's important to try to invalidate those, or try to invalidate those as much as possible by scientific process method. Because if you find at the end of the day you've spent $10,000 on features and users only want 2 of those, then that's not really it's not really good time to value for what was for building 80% fluff when the users only wanted 20% of something. So from a small enterprise perspective, or from a small startup perspective, startups are small enterprises. But from a startup perspective, it's important to be able to test rapidly, and that may involve buying something. That may involve buying your own content management system, buying from vendors to try to see, do users like this feature? Do they like the ability to say, if they want to upload something, do they like dragging and dropping to this? Do they like interacting with the data in a certain way? Because at the end of the day, if a developer is building for a use case that is not backed by significant market, it's ultimately not worth it for that enterprise to continue building in that space.
Great points.
I think there's going to be scenarios where, you know, you need the value within a certain time frame, right? Like regulations are changing or a new market's opening up. There's something in the external world that you can't control that has a date, a start date, or a deadline associated with it, and you're going to have to fit within that. So you're going to have a time to value requirement. You're going to have to, you know, just like, you know, the ROI equation, you know, there are limits to what you can do, and so you might have a time to value limit that then you have to figure out, to meet that, is buying or building possible, right? That might be a hard stop on one of those two.
Awesome. Any other considerations? Got it. What about measurement? You know, like what have you seen work in measuring the time to value? You know, what have they, especially when you're engaging in rapid development, you know, they looked at it just in terms of monetization? Have they looked at it in terms of market share, customers, customer ads? You know, where have you seen, what are effective metrics that you've seen have worked when they're trying to quantify the value that they're getting out of the platform, you know, attached to the things that they're building or they're buying?
Well, I know in my space, in application security, we compete on time to value. Like, you know, if you know, someone buys our solution and, you know, it takes months to get the value out of it, they, you know, it just might not be an adequate solution for them, because they might have to ship their product and have the security testing happen before they ship the product. So that so obviously time to value, if you're selling something, is a competitive differentiator. And then there also just might be, you know, if it just takes too long to get this up and running, I can't buy your product, or I can't buy your service. So, you know, I think that, you know, people people have expectations around time to value, and if you don't meet them, you're just disqualified. I think a lot of times. I don't know if that's doesn't really answer your question about how to measure it, but
No, that's a big point. I mean, especially in a product like yours, right? That you're helping to accelerate that time to value. And oftentimes, if you don't achieve the value, the product gets killed or not bought, right?
A lot of times we're replacing manual testing processes. And so if it takes as long to get us up and running, than it would have been to just like hire labor and do the manual pen test. You know, that's not good for us. Because even if we're cheaper, we didn't meet the requirement.
Mm-hmm.
From a startup perspective or very lean enterprise perspective, I personally look a lot at customers, clients, people that are using the platform, or people that are using features of the platform. If I'm developing a solution and I'm noticing that I'm not getting a lot of traction, if I'm selling a suite of software, if I'm selling a single product, and I'm noticing and I'm noticing that the audience is not, that the audience that's using it could be bigger, or it's not as big as I anticipated it was. For me personally, it's the size of the audience that I'm affecting that really makes the biggest success as a startup, because that way I'm able to understand the amount of impact I'm having, or if I push a new feature out, how many people would see value in it or see benefit in it, and I'm able to get that immediate feedback from it. If I have a user base of 10 people for a new app that I just developed, I won't be able to get as much feedback as, say, if I had a user base of 1,000 people that would be able to immediately say, well, only 700 of them, 700 of them use a use case, but the other 300 aren't, and we have to identify why those 300 aren't, or if that's their own entirely separate niche. So from a startup, feedback and perspective being really important to us.
What's the relationship between, you know, you're talking about startup, right? And I love that you mentioned that your first things that you're measuring aren't necessarily monetization. You know, especially a lot of startups are focused on adding customers before they even figure out how to monetize it, for that matter. When you think about those initial steps, you know, where does the human-centered process factor in? You know, where does the continual process of validating value factor in for you?
So from a standpoint of, let's say that if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's understanding like where does value kind of factor into the very early development process, or could you repeat that again, just so I'm
yeah. I mean,
again.
You're building the software for a person,
Mm-hmm.
or a set of personas, right?
Yes.
Those personas have jobs to be done that you're trying to meet and attach to an unmet need and deliver value. So, you know, and one of the failure points I've seen in a lot of development projects has been, we're building features, spending lots of money building features, but it doesn't actually deliver the value that the customer's asking for. You know, so what have you seen work in meeting my customer where they're at, not necessarily even what they're asking for, but what they need, and meeting that unmet need attached to the time to value? You know, what have you seen work there? What haven't you seen work there?
Gotcha. I should have my coffee in the afternoon. From a startup perspective, it's, and full disclaimer, every experience is different. Every industry is different, but from what I see is so is so important is that when someone is starting out with this very lean methodology, quantifying how much users will pay for something, or um, uh, how much of an existing market they're tapping into. It's let's say that users are using a banking service, and there's X number of users that are using this banking service, and they value it at, let's say, if they pay $10 a month for it, and you multiply that by a number of users, a startup team is able to see what kind of the market is for that, and they're able to see how many folks from that market can they capture for their new feature, which could be a different take on that market, but it could be something very similar. If that answers the question, it's difficult because every industry, every situation is kind of different, and a measure of value. I take it from a statistical perspective of the more people you have testing something, the better. And whether or not 9 out of 10 people say it's garbage, or everyone says it's amazing, that's still valuable information that says, hey, at first we were thinking about doing fintech, but now we're doing edtech instead, because we find our users don't need help with transactions, they need help with understanding which transactions are valuable to them. And that was one of my projects a time ago.
Awesome.
Yeah, I like to just think of it as fine-tuning the software when you're developing it, so to speak. So, when you kind of, let's say you have a form that you got to have, and you're collecting data on that form. You to start out with, you could just have, if you need 5 fields, you could have 5 text boxes. But eventually you say, well, you know what? They keep typing this one wrong, so I need it to be a lookup list. And then you start to realize that, oh, this is a numeric value, but the value shouldn't be greater than 10, and should be between 5 and 10. So you start to build more parameters around it as it starts to keep used more and more. But to get it up and going really, really quickly, you might just get the bare bones out there. So in a real simplified example of a survey, in-house, obviously you start scaling with all kinds of users. You could just say, well, in-house, I'm just going to train them all so that they know this field is numeric, and don't enter a text value on alphanumeric, just enter a number, right? So that you get it up and going. But and then you start to still realize, you fine tune it. So you can sometimes cut the time down by simplifying the requirements initially, and then you can start to phase in more and more fine tuning of it, and figuring out where does that fine tuning need to be, where are they making the most mistakes, and that's what you address. So you just kind of continue doing an 80-20 rule, where's the bang for the buck to improve the software, so that you're achieving what you need to, but you can't do it right away. Obviously it's something that you're going to start distributing outside your business. That's you have less control over the audience, so therefore you have to have more controls built into the software to prevent less mistakes from happening, so to speak. But so there's a trade-off too, but it does kind of come into this time to value type scenario.
So if I'm interpreting you right, one of the things you're mentioning there, I think, is minimum viable product. Get it out there, get reaction, get people using the platform so they can translate what might be a requirement they understood or didn't understand from something that's much more visual. They can touch it, they can feel it, they can interact with it. You learn very quickly what's working, what's not working. And then you're reacting to that. So you found out, hey, it shouldn't be a numerical field, or it shouldn't be this, or it shouldn't be that. And maybe they're expecting a different set of features. You can react to that as a developer and iterate with them and that accelerates time to value because you're hitting their most important things first. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Exactly. So within reason, I don't know, it depends on what all the requirements are, but a lot of software really is simple data information gathering, and keeping it simple knowing that you're not going to hit it right on the mark exactly right, but getting people using it and then figuring out what's not working the best and fixing that and getting feedback, user groups, power users. Now I am referring to more of an internal development for internal enterprise users, not so much product development that you're going to use for outside users, because once you start going to the outside, it's a whole different program. It's really got to be very solid. But when you're dealing with internal users where you can train them and educate them, you know, you can start to figure these things out of, okay, and I mean, I've done a lot of that stuff where you go back to the database now, you start mining the data and looking at it, and you can start to see here's a trend. People keep misspelling Milwaukee wrong, so I'm going to make it so they can't spell it wrong anymore. You know, you can just start to look at these things and over time and make corrections to the software, but at least you get something up and going quickly. Oftentimes, you know, we shoot for too high of an accurate, perfect software, and it just takes too long to ever get it developed that, you know, now people are still doing it on spreadsheets and aggregating it the old way. I'm just using that example, but, you know, whatever their current mechanism is to do the job, you know, sometimes we overkill it, and then, you know, it never gets out there. So you do need to get something out and released, and then react to how it's performing and continue. So iterative approaches are definitely have their advantages. I guess if it's something that's going to go in the outside world, then you've got to, you could still have a user group that you're going to test with, a beta test group, so to speak, and do that same approach, but they tend to want rewards for that. There's not a lot of people who are really willing to go and do testing for you for nothing. I guess if it's a product that they end up using when it's all said and done, that's worthwhile. I remember back when I used to be on the Windows technical testing group with old versions of NT, and you just couldn't wait to get that next beta release, and you'd be testing all these different scenarios on it, and it was just like really, you know, from a geek perspective, that was really cool. But that it seems like that doesn't happen so much anymore in that fashion. With that types of feedback, people are more. Software's gotten so good. It's hard to measure against it because there's so much. I mean, it's not that there aren't a lot of bugs out there, but gosh, if you look at the main commercial products on the market that you're measuring up against when you're developing something from scratch, there's a lot of usability that you're getting measured against. So the expectations are actually really high when you're developing something from scratch. So, and that affects that time to market, because even if it's a simple web page, by making it look pretty, getting your style sheets right, getting things to lay out right, making sure that it works on a couple different browsers, that can be really time consuming. And, you know, some frameworks are better at it than other frameworks are. You know, there's a lot of factors in it. So it you know, ultimately comes back to what are the requirements that are trying to be achieved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Let's go on to the next question. And this came up a couple times. And you know, I'd love to maybe even orient this one not just around maintenance, but also around security. So when you think about what the maintenance considerations are around software, build versus buy, what are the things you're thinking about here? What are the things you're thinking about inside the context of maintain a piece of software, long-term, mid-term, and you know, also how does security factor into the ideas of maintenance? You know, who's responsible for it? Who's thinking about it? So a lot of angles to bounce off on this one. So what's your perspective on this one, guys?
Well, I can start because I think security is a huge factor with maintenance. Even with, you know, with software you purchase, you have to, you know, keep patching that and keeping it up to date, and any infrastructure it needs, other things it connects to, whether it's a database or, you know, storage or whatever, even operating systems over time. Like, when apps last for 25 years, they've migrated across several Windows platforms, right? Because they end of life them. So even when you buy packaged software, you certainly have to maintain that. But I do think it gets more complicated when you build software. And we have a saying in security that if you're using open source software to build your software, it ages like milk. It eventually is going to get a bug in it, and you're going to have to, or a security hole, and you're going to have to update that. So while a software vendor is fixing their bugs, they're adding new functionality, they're releasing their packaged software on a regular cadence, they're rolling in these security fixes for any components they're using or they're finding. But you, as someone who builds software, even if you're not adding functionality, you're going to have to think about keeping it updated over time. And the fact that we're leveraging so much open source now to build upon, I don't know how many customers I had that had apps built on Struts 2. That's the one that bit Equifax. It's a very common Java framework, and Struts 2 has had a critical vulnerability probably every year for like the last 5 or 6 years. So if you decided it's an older framework and maybe you decided to start building on it 10 years ago, but for like the last 5 or 6 years, you've had this maintenance cost of pushing out a new release of your software, whether it was to customers or to your data center or to the cloud. And that's because, leveraging open source helps with that time to value, right? It gets the app built faster and easier and probably with less testing, but then you're paying with maintenance down the road because there's new known vulnerabilities found in these common packages that you're going to have to deal with. So I think there's flavors of this, whether you're buying or building. You have to work this into your TCO of the maintenance is going to be part of that TCO.
From a security standpoint, and maybe because I like this decentralization, blockchain to a degree, all this other stuff, security for obscurity has never been kind of my take, my approach on things. But I recognize there's if there's common libraries that something is being built off, what I generally like doing is understanding what is the niche, what is the unique, what is the concealable part of those that if you're building something of it, if there's a bug in an open part of the library or something that just shows up that should be fixed, to what part of that concealed portion that you're building, that unique rare IP or whatever it is that you're developing, to where is that being translated and what needs to be fixed in what you're developing, concurrent to what is being discovered in the open source. That's my take on kind of a security in that regard.
Is there any questions on liability, that we should be thinking about here? Who's really who's accountable? Is it a situation where you're always accountable? It's just a question of how much help you have, or is it a question in sort of shifting the accountability? If you think about something goes wrong in the cloud and you can shift some of that blame toward the SaaS provider, the cloud provider that makes up a large portion of your system. What's your thoughts on that?
Everything is about de-risking, and it's very interesting that's being brought up, because in sharing liability, if you are a small cybersecurity business selling something in cybersecurity, or if you're dealing with it and suddenly something just blows up in your face and suddenly all your clients' information is revealed and open there, you have the ultimate liability of from a legal standpoint, making things right again with each one of those clients. But when multiple vendors are involved, obviously that spreads the risk. There's considerations geographically as well, is that what works in one nation or one country may not work in others. For the United States, if you're developing something for usage in the United States, will you eventually scale to a point that you'll be in Europe or in Asia? In Europe, particularly, there's a number of compliance factors, including GDPR, which is an application prepared and ready to make that transition. Is there a plan operationally to ever operate in that region? Or vice versa, if a company is operating out in Europe and they're domiciled there, what are the considerations of moving to the United States? And what does that shift look like? Even what would happen with Brexit, what happens when you have to shift code from, you're talking about UK and the EU being together, but now they're in this potential state of being apart. What are the geographic considerations there? So there's a lot in that way to consider.
Yeah, I think a lot of liability is going to be contractual. Sort of the default of shrink wrap software or any kind of end user license is going to be, we're not liable. But of course, when you get into enterprise software and services, you can do anything in a contract, and that liability for downtime, missing data, security breaches, and whatever is going to be contractual. And I think Tom brought up the economic power differences between small vendors and big vendors, and small enterprises and big enterprises. So yeah, if you're buying something from one of the big players, you're not really going to get them to be able to do anything. But on the other hand, if you're a relatively large enterprise and you're buying something from a small vendor or a small service provider, you might be able to get them to take on some liability. The problem with that is if they're so small, they're just going to go out of business. So,
Yeah.
You could say like, well, you have to have insurance policy if you're that small and things like that. So I think if you're, a mid-size or a larger enterprise, you probably can get concessions around liability from the software vendor or service provider. But the flip side, you're going to get a lot less being a small player asking that from someone who's much larger.
Yeah, you're right, Chris. I mean, as far as the liability goes, this we did with our customers is find out, ask them what's the minimum liability amount we must carry in order to work with them. And a lot of times it's a $1 million or $3 or $5 million policy you've got to carry when you're small, working with, because pretty much all startups are small, depending on what you're doing, but knowing who your customers are and what you're delivering. So, but yeah, you hit it right in the head. That you're just going to carry liability insurance, and your customers are going to tell you what they're expecting you to have. And if it's too much, you just can't go into that market space. You got to find something new if you're delivering something like that for software. But
so maybe as we get to our last. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to jump in if you don't mind for a second on this. That if you're going to sign something that's already drafted up, just always assume that contract or that agreement that you're signing is completely in the other party's favor. If you haven't made any changes to it, because if their lawyers are doing their job, they're going to protect their client, which is not you; it's the person that you're signing with. And the other part to consider is, there's liability and there's shifting liability, but I shouldn't say everyone, most people remember the Target hack, but can you say the third-party provider's name that was the entry point? Probably not. So even if it's their fault, you still have to take the PR or the business, that angle as well, the business PR side.
Big point. So in the last couple minutes here, Why
We
don't
do have,
we?
sorry to interrupt, Nate. We do have some questions from the audience, so we can pause until you get through kind of the last few questions. I know we're about 10 minutes to the hour. Otherwise, I can read those. Just kind of thought I'd throw that out there.
Oh, we do. Awesome. Yeah, I didn't see those in the Q&A.
No worries. I can read
There.
them off. So the first one's from Drew, and he's asking, how willing does an organization need to be to change process to match a bias solution where typically build enables no process? Is it a benefit or is it a curse? And I can reread if you need.
Well, I think it's a good question because you know, a lot of businesses, when you're purchasing a product, a lot of times it forces you to change your business process. And obviously, when you're building, you can build around the business process, but is the business process actually good in the first place? So it's something that, you know, when making that decision, sometimes it's good to have one consulting company come in to just analyze the process in the first place and help you find a product that would fit your business process or improve the business process and find a product that would fit it. And then if not, then build it. But, you know, most business processes, I mean, I don't know, you know, unless they're really, really lean, you know, there's always probably some area of improvement. It's just, you know, I've always done it this way. And sometimes if, you know, you make too much of a change to meet a software solution, you're going to have people who are going to resist it and you'll end up having even worse productivity. So it's a tricky balance with that, depending on, you know, again, what it is, but it's a good point.
Anything else anyone wants to add? Otherwise, I can read the second one as well. So our second question was from Lucas, and Lucas asks, given that software usage, or at least business processes enabled by software, often causes software to linger well beyond expected lifespan, how does that impact selecting between a SaaS and a non-SaaS software on the buy side?
That's a good problem if you're the provider. You don't even know when to turn it off because they're not quite sure they bought something years ago and they're still using it. They don't even know if they even need it anymore. You know, that's really somewhat of a management issue of keeping track of what's all being used and does it still apply for your processes, for your environment, because there's a lot of solutions out there that people just keep subscribing to, and they keep paying that amount of money to it over and over. And you know, whether there's better ones. I mean, look now, Zoom's the hot one. I remember when WebEx was the hottest thing ever. You know, and it's like these things, they're kind of the same thing over and over. They just keep changing. What's the one that everyone's using now, and they just came out with new features. But WebEx back in the day was quite expensive, and some people even switched to other products and still kept paying that WebEx bill because they didn't even realize it, and that bill comes in every month, and it's just part of accounting. Accounting never questions it. Once it's been approved, they just issue those payments. So, you know, it's good to reanalyze those budgets, you know, at least once a year, if not more, and looking at anything, especially a software as a service, and making sure that it's not an expense that, you know, is being paid for. Or common thing is someone wanted it within an organization and they left, and they're the only ones that were using it, and now that bill's still being paid and no one's even using that product anymore. So yeah, you gotta keep an eye on that. I hope that's what he was looking, you know, asking about, but yeah.
Yeah, I know that it's if you're a startup and you're developing something, if you have a developer that puts in 5,000 lines of code into building a backend or some framework, some feature, some function, it's not as easy to, if it's a core integration of the product, it's not as easy to put down as if you were to say just have a buy solution as well, because now it's suddenly it's absorbed into what the fabric of what you're doing, and you can't just drop it like say dropping WebEx for Zoom. But from the buy side, I see it as a measure of avoiding those absorption issues where suddenly you're paying overhead costs or paying maintenance in a respect, whether it's time, whether it's actual cost, that you wouldn't have to otherwise with a buy solution.
Awesome. So I know we have a couple minutes left here. Make sure we respect everybody's time. They move into maybe an open session after 4 o'clock. Are there any closing comments? What would be the closing comments that you would have for the audience on this topic as a whole? If you thought about this sort of, I've got a 30-second kind of, this is my nugget that you should have. What would be that representation of they should take home from you on this particular topic?
Well, I like the total cost of ownership way of thinking about this. It's just you got to make sure that you're getting all those costs in there. You just don't have hidden costs, like there's hidden labor somewhere that you're not accounting for. Maintenance and security patching over time and things like that. So TCO is a great way to look at this. It might be hard to get it right, but I think it's a lens that you should really attempt to look at it through. But I'm going to contradict myself a little bit and say, time to value can also be important. Like businesses don't exist in a vacuum. There's competitive pressures, there's regulation, the macroeconomics change. So even, TCO, you still got to think of time to value. And I'm glad we discussed both of those things.
And nuggets: don't build what you don't need. Do the market research to see what people want. Conduct tests, build MVPs, get testing as much as possible, see what needs to happen. Know what's costly over the long term. Don't overexpose yourself. Stuff like that.
Kind of adding to both of those, it's just, knowing the requirements right off the gate, and you're not going to know all the requirements, but software evolves. It's never going to stop whether you build it or you buy it. There's going to be a newer version. I mean, look at how many versions of Windows are out, and iOS has been out, and Android's been out. I mean, those things just don't stop. You're continually adding features to it. There's always something that can be done. So, whether you build it or you buy it, expect to, there's going to be some cost to maintaining it. The last section we were talking about, there's going to be some cost. It's not going to just be, it's rare for something to just be done. There's continually always features. So, regardless if it's built or bought, make sure, try to consider what's being used to build it so that it can sort of last longer as well. That's a big part of it. Developers tend to like to use what's cool at that point in time. So you can't just base it on what's cool. You've got to look at something that's kind of has some longevity to it, so that it can, because I think it was mentioned earlier, like Christy mentioned it, there's a lot of software out there that's been out there a long time, and it'll be out there a lot longer than what you realize. And so that actually those investments were good investments if they've been around that long. So, taking that into account, you want to build something that has the ability to be maintained.
I missed my favorite questions for this panel, so I'm sorry, but I would just say make sure that you know what you're actually buying as opposed to renting.
Big point. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much. That time flew by. Super appreciative of you taking the time to participate in the panel today. And really, really interesting conversation. And hopefully everybody else found this interesting as well, as much as I did. I know that we can also stick around afterwards, so I'll close down the presentation here, and everyone's welcome to hang out and talk about anything you want to talk about in this topic, and pop a fresh brewski if you have one, and we can have some chats.
Awesome. And just to interject on behalf of the WTA board, thank you so much, Nate, Tom, Michael, and I was going to say Chris W., but you're both Chris W. So thank you again very, very much for taking the time. Very insightful, I think, a very important topic that a lot of organizations debate on probably a very regular basis. So we appreciate it. Definitely for everyone who's on the call today, look out for our July event. That will also be virtual and free. So if you have friends or colleagues or people that are interested in the WTA, that'd be a great opportunity to get them to attend an event and get to know a little bit about who we are. And then to Nate's point, we also have Chuck had posted the link for the happy hour in the chat. So we'd love to see you there. Otherwise, have a fabulous rest of your Thursday and a great rest of your week. And we really appreciate you for taking time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.